There are moments in history when the world seems to pause, when the weight of its own questions hangs heavy in the air, waiting for someone to answer. The 19th century was such a moment. The earth trembled with invention, steel, smoke, factories that reached for the sky, yet beneath the hum of progress, there was a quieter sound, the breath of those who labored unseen. Men and women bent beneath machines that never slept, their hands shaping a world that rarely remembered their names. Out of that silence, a man began to write. He wrote not from power, but from exile. Not from wealth, but from hunger. His ink was the dust of London streets, his paper the dim light of borrowed rooms. His name was Karl Marx, and though he lived in the shadows of the world he tried to change, his words would one day touch every corner of it. He dreamed of a world where no one stood above another, where the measure of a person was not gold, but dignity. He spoke of labor not as chains, but as creation, the quiet miracle of human hands shaping their own destiny. Tonight, as the stars drift over a sleeping world, his story stirs once more, not as a call to arms, but as a lullaby of remembrance. As every age rediscovers him when the balance of life begins to tremble, when progress forgets its soul, and people begin to wonder what it truly means to live, to work, to belong. Begin, Chapter 1. Chapter 1, The Seeds of Revolution, Part 1. Before Karl Marx was a name whispered through revolutions, he was simply a boy, curious, restless, and full of questions that the world around him could not answer. He was born on a quiet spring morning in 1818, in the small Rhineland town of Trier, where the cobbled streets still echoed with the rhythm of church bells and horse carts. The Napoleonic Wars had only recently faded, but their shadows still clung to Europe's heart. The old world was trembling, unsure of what would rise from its ruins. Karl's father, Heinrich, was a lawyer, practical, rational, a man of law and light. His mother, Henriette, gentle but firm, carried warmth in her words and the weight of tradition in her eyes. The household was one of books and debate, where ideas were spoken with the same reverence others gave to prayer. Yet even as a child, Marx felt the tension between comfort and conscience, between what was and what could be. Outside, the world was changing faster than anyone could see. Steam rose from the first great machines, billowing over the rivers and towns of the industrial age. Fields that had once fed families now fed factories. Men, women, and even children began to trade the rhythm of the seasons for the rhythm of gears. And though the progress was dazzling, its cost was heavy. Poverty spread like fog, quiet, suffocating, unseen by those who sat in warmth. Marx saw it all, not as a philosopher yet, but as a boy watching his world shift. The air of Trier carried the hum of transformation, and in that hum, he heard both promise and sorrow. His teachers called him brilliant, but unruly. His essays, even in youth, spoke not of obedience but of freedom. He read poetry late into the night, chasing meaning through words the way others chased comfort. The time he left for university, Marx had already begun to pull at the threads that held society together. At Bonn, then at Berlin, he discovered a new kind of hunger, not for food, but for understanding. Philosophy became his refuge, his rebellion, his quiet war against ignorance. He devoured the words of Hegel, whose ideas danced between reason and spirit, history and destiny. But even as he admired Hegel's vastness, Marx felt a disquiet, a sense that these grand systems of thought were missing the heartbeat of the people who lived beneath them. He was young, proud, and poor, a scholar with ink-stained hands and fire in his eyes. He argued with professors, drank with poets, and filled notebooks with half-finished dreams. He fell in love with words, with truth, and most of all, with a woman who saw both, Jenny von Westphalen. Jenny was everything he was not, noble by birth, graceful by manner, and patient where he was reckless. Yet their souls moved in the same direction. She believed in him before the world did, believed in the restless mind behind his disheveled hair and endless monologues. Together they walked along the riverbanks, speaking of justice, art, and the strange beauty of human struggle. She once wrote that loving him felt like holding lightning, a force both brilliant and perilous. But lightning, by nature, must strike. And so, as the young Karl grew into a man, his ideas began to take shape, shaped not by comfort, but by the friction of the world. He began to write with purpose, his essays questioning everything from religion to monarchy. His words were too bold for the times, and the newspapers that dared to print them were quickly silenced. By 25, he had already made enemies of kings and censors. Still, he kept writing. Still, he believed. For beneath all his anger and intellect, there lived a deep compassion, a quiet ache for those who worked, who suffered, who hoped without ever being seen. He wanted to give their struggle a voice, to turn their pain into language. And so, the seeds were planted, not in comfort, but in exile, love, and defiance. Seeds that would one day grow into a philosophy powerful enough to shake empires. But before the fire could spread, it needed air, and Marx's next years would give him that in abundance. For his journey was only beginning, and the world he sought to understand was far from ready to be understood. And so, as the night deepens over Trier, the boy who once dreamed of justice packs his books and leaves home, stepping quietly into history's waiting storm. The train that carried Karl Marx away from Trier seemed to echo with the rhythm of his own heart, uncertain, alive, and hungry for meaning. Outside the window, the German countryside unfolded in soft grays and greens, but inside his mind, entire worlds were shifting. He was leaving behind the warmth of home for something far less certain, the restless promise of thought. At the University of Berlin, the air itself seemed charged with debate. Young men spoke of philosophy as if it were prophecy, their voices thick with conviction. In the dim lecture halls, Marx listened to professors speak of idealism, the belief that ideas, not matter, shape reality. To most, these were elegant theories. But to him, they felt incomplete. He saw hunger on the streets, child labor in factories, families torn apart by poverty. How could pure thought alone explain a world so full of injustice? In cafes thick with pipe smoke, he began to argue, his words sharp but alive. He believed that philosophy should not only interpret the world, it should change it. That belief would become his compass, his creed. And though it would cost him dearly, he would never let it go. It was around this time that Marx met a man whose name would forever be bound to his own, Friedrich Engels. Engels was the son of a wealthy industrialist, but unlike most of his class, he had looked beneath the surface. He had seen the misery inside his father's factories, had walked among workers whose hands were scarred by labor. Engels carried something rare, compassion sharpened by guilt, and intelligence tempered by empathy. Their friendship was immediate, electric. Together, they would build something larger than themselves, a vision of the world not as it was, but as it could be. While, Jenny, now his wife, stood steadfast beside him. They married despite her family's disapproval, love defying class, convention, and comfort. In the years that followed, they would share not luxury but hardship, rented rooms, borrowed money, and the constant watch of authorities. Still, Jenny never wavered. She edited his manuscripts, soothed his rages, and reminded him, in her quiet, enduring way, that even revolutionaries must remember tenderness. Marx's writing began to deepen, to darken. His essays dissected society with surgical precision, exposing how wealth and labor were bound by invisible chains. He wrote of alienation, the way work, under capitalism, could strip a person of their humanity, turning the worker into a cog within a machine. He spoke of the ruling class, those who owned the means of production, and of the working class, those who created everything yet owned nothing. His ideas were not born from bitterness, but from empathy. He wanted to understand why suffering seemed endless, why progress always demanded a price. And though his words were dense, sometimes angry, at their core lay a simple question, one that echoed through all his work: how can a world built by so many belong to so few? But such questions were dangerous. In an age of kings and empires, to question the order of society was to court exile. When Marx's writings began to reach wider audiences, the authorities grew wary. His newspaper was shut down, his name placed on lists. He fled first to Paris, then to Brussels, always one step ahead of the censor's ink. Yet exile did not silence him, it sharpened him. In Paris, he found a community of thinkers, dreamers, and revolutionaries, men who believed that history was not fate, but something that could be rewritten by human hands. The cafés were filled with whispers of change, and Marx, notebook in hand, was ready to listen. Here that he and Engels began their most important collaboration, a small pamphlet that would one day set the world ablaze, the Communist Manifesto. They wrote not in comfort, but in urgency. Line by line, they poured their beliefs into words that still echo across time. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. They spoke of the working class rising not in hatred, but in hope, to build a world where labor served life, not profit. It was a dream, fragile and vast, written by two men in exile, bound by faith in the human spirit. When the manifesto was published in 1848, Europe trembled. Revolutions broke out across cities: Vienna, Paris, Berlin, the sound of boots and voices filling the air. But dreams, however bright, burn quickly when faced with power. The uprisings were crushed, and the smoke of hope settled into silence once again. Marx, now marked as a dangerous man, fled once more, this time to London, where his true test would begin. For the fire he had ignited had not yet found its form. And in the fog of that sprawling city, among poverty and loss, his ideas would be refined not by theory, but by pain. And so, as the lamplights of Paris dimmed behind him, Karl Marx crossed another border, carrying with him nothing but his words, his love, and a belief too heavy for one lifetime to hold. Chapter 2: The Exile in London. Greeted Karl Marx not with applause, but with rain. Endless, grey, and cold, the kind that seeps quietly into one's bones. The great city roared with industry, chimneys coughing smoke into the sky, factories glowing orange through the mist, carriages rattling across cobblestones slick with mud. It was the heart of the empire, the crown jewel of capitalism, and Marx, penniless and hunted, found himself standing at its edge. He and Jenny settled in the cramped rooms of Soho, where the walls were thin and the rent unforgiving. Their furniture was scarce, their pantry often empty. Children played in narrow alleys below their window, their laughter mingling with the cry of merchants and the distant clatter of iron wheels. It was a world overflowing with life, yet hollowed by hunger, the perfect mirror for Marx's thoughts. Here, in this small corner of London, he began his greatest work. Not a speech, not a pamphlet, but a vast, consuming study of how the world truly worked, a book that would try to map the soul of capitalism itself. He called it Das Kapital. Each day, he walked to the British Museum, where he would sit for hours in the reading room, a silent figure beneath the dome of glass. Around him, the empire's scholars wrote of conquest and science, but Marx wrote of the unseen, of workers, wages, and the invisible machinery of profit. His ink was slow, his health failing, but his mind blazed. Outside those library walls, life was merciless. Jenny pawned their belongings one by one, a coat, a ring, a cradle. Illness crept into their home, claiming 3 of their children before they could even reach their 5th birthdays. Grief wrapped itself around them like fog, but still Marx wrote. He wrote through sickness, through hunger, through nights when even the candles burned out too soon. Moments when despair nearly broke him. When he doubted not just the world, but himself. He would pace the room long after midnight, whispering half-sentences to the dark. Jenny would listen in silence, her hands trembling as she sewed torn clothes by candlelight. She knew he carried a burden too vast to share, the belief that he must explain the suffering of millions through the fragile tool of words. And yet, even in that struggle, something beautiful remained. On rare evenings, when a bit of money found its way to them, they would sit by the window, sharing tea and laughter with their children. Marx would tell stories, of ancient empires, of heroes, of impossible dreams. His daughters adored him, calling him the more for his dark hair and restless eyes. To them, he was not a revolutionary, but a father who could turn history into poetry. As the years passed, London became both his prison and his muse. The city itself seemed to embody everything he sought to understand: wealth glittering beside ruin, abundance built on exhaustion. He walked through its streets as though tracing the veins of an idea, watching how capital flowed and labor bled. He saw the working poor sleeping beside factories they would never own. He saw children carrying coal through fog as the mansions of the rich glowed in the distance. These were not abstractions, they were evidence. Proof that the world was divided not by chance, but by design. And in his notebooks, between theories and figures, he often scribbled fragments of reflection, small moments of tenderness amid analysis. Lines like, "To be radical is to grasp things by the root. And for man, the root is man himself." He was not writing for governments or kings. He was writing for the nameless, for the workers who built palaces but lived in shadows, for the mothers who buried their children quietly and returned to labor the next morning. He wanted to give shape to their suffering, meaning to their silence. Even as his ideas grew in strength, his life grew harder. The debts deepened. Friends distanced themselves. His health faltered again and again. There were days when Jenny would find him slumped over his manuscripts, fevered, whispering that he could no longer go on. And yet, somehow, he always did. For in the dim light of that London flat, amid grief and hunger, he found what every philosopher seeks: truth not in theory, but in endurance. And through endurance, his vision began to crystallize, that history itself was a story of struggle, that the world moved not by divine will, but by human hands. That every empire, every economy, every age carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. And so, night after night, he kept writing, each page a quiet act of rebellion against despair. The rain outside fell endlessly, washing the city clean again and again. But within those small rooms, something far greater was being built, not of stone or iron, but of thought. The kind of thought that would one day shake the world. Passed, and the world outside their narrow street began to shift. Revolutions had flickered across Europe like sparks in a storm, only to be extinguished one by one. The dream of sudden liberation had faded, replaced by something quieter, a battle not of swords, but of ideas. Marx, though far from the barricades, had become one of its unseen generals. His words moved where his body could not. He wrote for journals, sending letters that carried across borders, words sharp enough to pierce empires. In dimly lit taverns and cramped workers' halls, his ideas were whispered, debated, defended. He had given people not just anger, but language, the ability to name the invisible chains around them. That, he believed, was the beginning of freedom. But freedom did not feed his family. The rent still came due, the illnesses still returned. Jenny, ever steadfast, became both nurse and comrade, managing what little they had with grace. She believed, as he did, that their suffering had purpose, that one day the world would understand why he had chosen this path. Yet even faith, when hungry, grows thin. In his notebooks, he often scrawled fragments of both fury and tenderness. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, he wrote once, the point, however, is to change it. It was not a boast but a lament, a quiet realization that words alone were never enough. The world turned slowly, and men rarely noticed the ones who tried to push it forward. Times, on cold evenings, Marx would walk alone along the Thames. The river shimmered like black glass under the gaslights, and the hum of the city pulsed around him, carriage wheels, distant laughter, the faint hiss of steam. He watched the lights of the factories flicker on the water's surface and thought of the men inside, the countless, faceless workers who would never know his name, but whose labor filled his every page. They were the true protagonists of his life story. He merely tried to write what they already lived. At home, Jenny would wait by the window, her candle trembling in the draught. When he finally returned, soaked from rain, she would wrap him in a blanket and tease him softly, calling him her storm chaser, her philosopher lost in the fog. And for a few quiet moments, the weight of history would lift. They would sit close, speaking little, listening instead to the faint hum of the city below. But even in those fleeting comforts, the shadow of poverty lingered. There were winters so cruel that they burned furniture for warmth. When their last surviving son died, Jenny wept until her voice broke. Marx, unable to console her, buried himself in his writing. He confessed later in a letter that his heart had turned to stone. Yet that stone, cold, unyielding, became the foundation of his greatest work. By the time the first volume of Das Kapital was completed in 1867, Marx had aged far beyond his years. His beard had gone white, his lungs weakened by endless smoke and damp air. Still, when he finally held the bound copy in his hands, he said nothing. He only traced the letters on the cover, as if uncertain whether the book belonged to him, or to everyone who had suffered with him. London's fog, a philosophy had been born that would travel further than its author ever could. Yet even as his ideas began to take root, Marx himself remained invisible, a man both everywhere and nowhere, shaping a world that still refused to see him. His friends sometimes found him late at night, hunched over his desk, coughing blood onto the pages he refused to stop writing. History, he once whispered, does not forgive those who grow tired too soon. And so he did not. The years blurred. Jenny's hair silvered, their daughters grew, and still the work continued. The walls of their small home became lined with books, volumes upon volumes, some written by him, others by those he had inspired. It was a life both tragic and triumphant, a quiet war fought with ink instead of fire. But every war leaves its wounds. Marx's health began to fail, and Jenny's followed soon after. The city that had once felt endless now seemed to close in around them. In their final winters together, they spoke less of revolution and more of memory, of the days in Cologne, of laughter and sunlight, of the lives they might have lived had history been kinder. And when Jenny passed away, something in Marx dimmed forever. He wrote only fragments after that, reflections, unfinished thoughts, dreams that never found their ending. The philosophers, he wrote once more, dream of heaven. But the real task is to make the earth just. He would follow her 2 years later, on a grey March morning in 1883. His friends found him in his armchair, his manuscripts beside him, his pen still resting against his hand. He had died as he had lived, in thought, in struggle, in silence. There was no crowd, no ceremony. Only a handful of mourners stood at his grave in Highgate Cemetery, the wind cold and indifferent. But the world he left behind had already begun to change. Voice, once ignored, once buried beneath London's fog, had become the quiet echo in 1,000 factories, 1,000 streets, 1,000 hearts that dared to believe that history could still be rewritten. And though he was gone, the idea he carried had only just begun to breathe. Chapter 3, The Fire Within, Power, Art, and Decay. Karl Marx's body was laid to rest in the still earth of Highgate. It seemed as though the world barely noticed. But history, like a patient tide, carries what is heavy beneath its surface, and sooner or later, it always returns. In the decades that followed his death, his words began to stir again, moving quietly from one continent to another. Students whispered them in candlelit rooms. Workers carried them in their pockets, smuggled through borders and prisons. His name, once spoken in exile, began to echo across languages and lands. It was no longer the name of a man, but the pulse of a movement. From the factories of Manchester to the fields of Russia, his ideas grew like wild roots, impossible to contain. To those who toiled under endless hours and hunger, he had given not just theory, but dignity. He had shown them that their suffering was not fate, but a system, one that could be understood, and therefore, undone. And so, from his pages, a flame was born. But flames do not stay gentle for long. In the East, revolutions began to stir. The old empires trembled. Tsars and monarchs, who had ruled for centuries, felt the ground shift beneath them. By the dawn of the 20th century, Marx's words were no longer whispers, they were banners. Workers of the world, unite, had become not just a call, but a prophecy. When 1917 arrived, the world's order cracked open. In the snow-covered streets of Petrograd, people marched not for kings, but for bread, and beneath their cries, one could almost hear his voice. The Russian Revolution was born, and with it, Marx's ghost seemed to rise again, fierce and alive. Revolutions, like all living things, are shaped not just by hope, but by hunger, for power, for order, for survival. As Lenin and his comrades built a new world from the ruins of the old, Marx's writings became both scripture and weapon. His theories were studied, quoted, and, in time, bent to serve the machinery of the state. In Moscow, banners bearing his likeness fluttered above great parades. His name was carved into stone, his image into monuments. He had become more than a thinker, he was now a symbol, vast and distant. And as with all symbols, the living pulse beneath his words began to fade. He had written of liberation, of equality, of humanity reclaiming its labor. But in the name of those same dreams, prisons filled, voices silenced, and new hierarchies rose. What had begun as a plea for compassion now marched under the weight of command. And yet, even within that distortion, a strange truth endured, his vision could not be erased. In the factories of Moscow and the shipyards of Leningrad, ordinary workers still spoke his name with reverence, not as a saint, but as one of their own. To them, he was not the stone face on a banner, but the weary father who had suffered as they did, who had believed that dignity belonged to everyone. Beyond the Iron Curtain, his ideas rippled further. In art and literature, they found new forms. Painters and poets, filmmakers and musicians began to reinterpret his dream, not as dogma, but as reflection. They spoke of alienation, of the loneliness within modern progress, of the cost of comfort. In their quiet rebellion, Marx's thought found its poetry again. West, too, his words refused to die. During the Great Depression, when banks collapsed and breadlines stretched through cities, people returned to his pages. They read his warnings, of markets that devour themselves, of labor reduced to numbers, and realized how eerily he had seen the future. It was as if the 19th century's exile had been whispering to the 20th, be careful what you build, and who it serves. And though governments feared him, artists loved him, not the man, but the mystery. For Marx had not merely written of politics, but of the human heart, of how work, when stripped of meaning, empties the soul. His was not just a theory of economics, but of existence. As the mid-century dawned, the world stood divided, two great powers staring at each other across oceans and ideology. The Cold War had begun, and between them stood the ghost of Karl Marx, invoked by both faith and fear. To some, he was a prophet of freedom. To others, the architect of oppression. But beneath all the noise, the speeches, the flags, the endless war of words, the quiet truth remained, his dream had been born from compassion. It was not about domination, but about balance, not about control, but about dignity. And so, while nations fought under his banner, the truest echo of his voice could still be heard elsewhere, not in palaces or parades, but in the small, forgotten corners of the earth. In a factory at dawn, where a man wipes sweat from his brow and wonders why his life feels borrowed. In a mother's sigh as she counts coins by lamplight, whispering hope into the dark. In the quiet hum of humanity, still asking the question he once dared to write. How can a world built by so many belong to so few? And though history had already begun to twist his words, their heartbeat endured, steady, human, and waiting to be understood again. The world that rose after the Second World War was weary, scarred, and searching for meaning. Cities smoldered like memories, nations stood divided between ruin and rebirth. Amid the rubble and rebuilding, Karl Marx's words drifted again, not as thunder, but as a low, enduring hum. In the East, they were spoken with certainty. In the West, with curiosity. And between them, an invisible line stretched like a wound across the world. For half a century, that wound would define humanity's story. On one side stood the capitalist dream, of markets, freedom, and endless growth. On the other, the socialist promise, of equality, solidarity, and shared destiny. Each side saw itself as the light, the other as shadow. And somewhere in that twilight, Marx's voice still lingered, distorted, but unforgotten. In Moscow, his name was sacred. Schoolchildren learned his theories before they learned their own histories. Statues of Marx and Lenin guarded public squares, their stone faces gazing forward, unblinking. The Soviet Union called itself the triumph of his vision, the world he had foreseen, finally alive. But behind those grand parades, the machinery of power ground slowly on. Dissent was silenced, dreams were disciplined, and fear replaced faith. And yet, within the heart of that vast empire, ordinary lives carried on, small, quiet, resilient. Workers still laughed, poets still wrote in secret, and old women still whispered prayers beneath the portraits of men who claimed to have replaced God. The empire built in Marx's name had grown immense, but its soul, like his own words, had become fragile and human once again. To the West, his ideas took on another life. In the universities of Paris, London, and New York, a new generation rediscovered him, not the symbol, but the thinker. They found beauty in his questions, in the poetry beneath the politics. They read his writings not as commands, but as reflections on what it means to be human in a world ruled by profit. For the young dreamers of the 1960s, the artists, the rebels, the students who filled the streets with chants and flowers, Marx became not a prophet of the past, but a mirror for the present. They saw in him not the gray uniformity of the East, but the spark of resistance, the courage to ask why. In smoky cafes and crowded lecture halls, his ideas danced with others, Freud, Sartre, Foucault, reshaping themselves into something new. They no longer belonged to one nation or one doctrine. They belonged to everyone who dared to question the quiet violence of the ordinary world. Meanwhile, across oceans, revolutions flared like constellations. In Cuba, a bearded dreamer named Fidel read Das Kapital beneath flickering lamplight and saw in it a map to freedom. In China, Mao Zedong turned Marx's theories into a force that would reshape a billion lives. Each, in their own way, carried his torch, but each also changed its color. In the mountains of Latin America, young guerrillas carried Marx's face on weathered paper, believing that one day justice would rise from the jungle. In Europe, students painted his words on walls, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." And in the quiet homes of factory workers, mothers whispered to their children about the world he had dreamed, a world that, somehow, still felt possible. History has a way of circling back. By the 1980s, the empires that bore his name began to crumble beneath their own weight. The Berlin Wall, that cold monument of division, fell like a sigh across the world. The Soviet Union, once a colossus, dissolved into memory. And with its fall, many believed Marx had fallen too. His statues were pulled down, his books gathered dust. The West declared victory. The world rushed once again toward markets and machines, toward the shimmering promise of endless growth. But beneath the noise of triumph, something quieter lingered, a question, like an echo: had humanity truly learned what he was trying to say? As the century turned, his words began to resurface, not in revolutions, but in reflections. Economists began to see in his warnings the shape of modern crises, the rising inequality, the hollowing of labor, the loneliness of endless consumption. Artists and writers turned again to his vision of the alienated worker, the soul lost inside the system it built. And in the soft light of a new millennium, Marx's ghost seemed to smile, not with pride, but with recognition. The world had changed, yet remained the same. The names of kings and markets were different, but the struggle beneath them was not. He had once written that history repeats, first as tragedy, then as farce. But perhaps, beneath that irony, there was something gentler too, a reminder that every age must learn anew what it means to be human. And so, his words continued to drift through the world, across classrooms and protests, across poems and quiet conversations. No longer as dogma, but as a whisper, look closer. The world you live in was made by human hands, and it can be remade by them, too. As night fell once more upon the modern city, its towers glowing like embers, its streets alive with both hope and exhaustion, it was easy to imagine Marx walking unseen among the crowds. Watching, listening, perhaps even smiling faintly. In every struggle for fairness, in every question of dignity, in every act of empathy that defies indifference, his spirit still lingers. Not as a ruler. Not as a god. But as a voice, quiet, patient, and human, reminding us that the dream he began was never meant to end. And so the story moves forward, into the heart of the present, where his legacy lives not in monuments or governments, but in the choices we make each day. The fire within still burns. It has changed its shape, but not its light. Chapter 4, Echoes of the Modern Age. The 21st century arrived not with trumpets, but with a quiet unease. The world stood taller than ever, its cities crowned with steel and light, its people connected by invisible webs of glass and code. Yet beneath the hum of machines and markets, an old restlessness stirred. The questions Karl Marx had once whispered into the heart of the 19th century were awakening again, softer this time, but deeper. For the first time in history, humanity had woven itself together into a single pulse, a digital heartbeat spanning oceans and continents. The internet promised equality of voice, a borderless republic of ideas. But as it grew, the same shadows began to creep through its light. Power gathered quietly in unseen hands. Wealth clustered around the few who controlled the many. The world had changed, and yet, in the glow of our screens, Marx's old warnings began to shimmer anew. He had spoken of alienation, that strange emptiness born when people become strangers to the work of their own hands. And now, in an age of automation and algorithms, that feeling returned with haunting familiarity. Millions worked not in fields or factories, but in offices and virtual worlds, shaping numbers they would never see, serving systems they could not touch. The tools had changed, but the distance remained. Marx had also written of capital as a living thing, not metal or money, but movement, a restless force that consumes and expands without end. And as the century unfolded, that prophecy seemed almost clairvoyant. The markets never slept. Data replaced gold, attention became the new currency. Every scroll, every click, every heartbeat was measured, sold, and fed back into the great engine of desire. Humanity had built the perfect machine, and, without realizing, had stepped inside it. Still, amidst that hum of speed and surplus, quiet voices rose. Scholars, activists, artists, each began to look back, to search for language that could name what was happening. They found it again in his pages, buried beneath dust but still alive. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Not as war, but as rhythm, the endless tide between those who own and those who labor. But this time, the battlefield was invisible. The struggle lived in the invisible code of economies, in the silent hierarchies of algorithms, in the quiet despair of those who felt unseen in a world that promised visibility to all. The poor no longer stormed castles, they scrolled through the glowing windows of lives they would never live. Inequality had grown subtler, but sharper, woven into the texture of everyday existence. And yet, just as in every age before, resistance began to bloom. Not from empires or armies, but from whispers, communities, and movements that spread like sparks across a darkening sky. Workers in distant factories demanded dignity. Creators sought fairness for their art. Young minds, restless and idealistic, gathered again around his words, not to worship, but to wonder. Marx was not a prophet of the past but a poet of possibility, someone who had seen the hidden machinery of the world and dared to believe it could be remade. His critique of capitalism was no longer an attack on progress, but a call to reimagine what progress could mean. Could humanity build a world that valued life over profit, connection over control, meaning over growth? The world, weary and wired, seemed to hesitate before that question. The dream of the 20th century, of endless expansion, had begun to feel heavy, unsustainable. The earth itself groaned beneath its weight. Forests vanished, oceans warmed, and cities swelled beyond measure. The same system that promised freedom now strained against the limits of its own making. And through that tension, Marx's voice seemed to echo faintly, not as accusation, but as memory. A reminder that humanity's story was never meant to be written by markets alone. That beneath the noise of commerce, there beats a quieter rhythm, the longing to belong, to create, to share, to rest. In that longing, his spirit found new life. Artists painted his face not as an idol, but as a question. Musicians wove his words into songs of defiance and tenderness. Even those who rejected his theories could not ignore his presence, for his shadow lay in every debate about justice, every cry against inequality, every hope that the world could still be kinder. And so, as the century unfolded, shimmering with light, trembling with uncertainty, it felt as though history was once again holding its breath. Humanity stood at a familiar crossroad, the same one Marx had seen long ago, between the pursuit of power and the preservation of meaning. The choice, as always, belonged not to systems, but to souls. And in the quiet of that realization, the modern world listened, not to the noise of progress, but to the faint, enduring whisper of its conscience. The millennium unfolded like a dream of glass and light, sleek, efficient, beautiful on the surface. Cities rose higher, algorithms grew smarter, and the human voice, once bound by distance, could now echo across the planet in seconds. Yet beneath that glow, something ancient stirred, the same unease that had haunted every empire before. Progress had quickened, but peace had not followed. Karl Marx had once written that capitalism carries the seeds of its own undoing, that in chasing infinite growth, it forgets the finite world it feeds upon. And as the 21st century deepened, that truth began to whisper from every corner of the earth. The seas grew warmer, the forests thinner, the skies heavier with smoke. The world's wealth increased, yet its balance waned. What Marx saw as the alienation of labor had become something larger, the alienation of humanity from the planet itself. In factories powered by fossil dreams, machines spun faster than thought. In cities lit by neon, people moved like clockwork, always connected, yet somehow more alone. The same tools that promised liberation became chains of habit, endless scrolling, endless buying, endless wanting. The rhythm of capital, once measured in coins and hours, now pulsed through every heartbeat, every notification, every sleepless night. And yet, in that quiet exhaustion, something gentle began to bloom, an awareness, fragile but growing. Scholars began to revisit Marx's words not as prophecy, but as poetry, a language for understanding the ache of the modern soul. His idea that value is born of labor found new meaning in the gig worker's long nights, in the coder's unseen hours, in the artist's invisible gift. His warning that unchecked production devours its foundation resonated with a planet gasping beneath the weight of its own consumption. Across continents, a new generation rose, thoughtful, uncertain, restless. They spoke not of class alone, but of climate, of care, of connection. They saw capitalism not merely as an economy, but as a story, one that could be rewritten. For the first time, Marx's vision of collective action began to stretch beyond factories and borders, reaching into the heart of environmental struggle. In quiet classrooms, young minds discussed his words alongside those of Greta Thunberg and Naomi Klein. They saw in his critique a mirror for their century, a way to understand how progress, when blind, becomes peril. To them, the revolution was not of fire, but of awareness. A change not of rulers, but of rhythm. Even technology, the symbol of modern mastery, began to be seen through his lens. Who owns the code that shapes our lives? Who profits from our data, our creativity, our attention? What does it mean to be human in a world where thought itself can be commodified? These questions, whispered at the dawn of the digital age, became the pulse of our time. And somewhere, between the hum of servers and the whisper of wind through dying forests, Marx's spirit seemed to watch with quiet understanding. He had never imagined this world of silicon and satellites, yet his insight into human longing, into the way systems shape souls, felt timeless. He had seen that progress without purpose is hollow, and that humanity, in all its striving, must return eventually to the heart, to empathy, to balance, to meaning. For perhaps that was always his truest revolution, not against kings or markets, but against forgetting what it means to care. In this century, his dream wears new faces: the coder who writes open-source software for all to share, the activist who plants trees in a city of concrete, the teacher who reminds their students that history is not fixed, but fluid. These are the quiet inheritors of his fire, not to destroy, but to renew. Though the world may never follow one ideology again, the echo of his ideas lingers like an afterglow, a reminder that every system is only as humane as the heart that guides it. As night falls over the glowing towers of the modern world, the reflections on their glass shimmer softly, like ghosts of old empires. The river of time moves on, carrying with it the same question that began it all: what kind of world do we wish to build, and for whom? It is no longer a question for philosophers alone. It is for all of us. And somewhere, beneath the hum of power and progress, that question waits, patient as ever, ancient as the human soul. Chapter 5, The Eternal Return. It has a way of softening everything, even the sharpest ideas, even the heaviest truths. As the world turns quietly beneath the weight of its own progress, the story of Karl Marx feels less like a storm now and more like a tide, something that rises, recedes, and always returns. His words, once shouted in revolutions and printed in manifestos, now move more gently, carried in the rhythm of our questions, our doubts, our hopes. The man who once walked the foggy streets of London, coat worn thin, pockets empty, remains alive not through statues or slogans, but through the pulse of inquiry he left behind. He had dreamed of a just world, but perhaps what he gave us was something more enduring: the courage to look at the world as it is, and to ask why it must be so. History has softened his edges. The firebrand has become a philosopher, the rebel a kind of poet. In classrooms and libraries, his books lie open beside those of his critics, no longer weapons, but mirrors. Students trace his words with tired eyes late into the night, not searching for a revolution, but for understanding. They find, hidden between the lines, not rage, but empathy. A longing for a life where human worth is not measured in profit or power, but in the quiet dignity of simply being. And perhaps that is why Marx endures, not because his world came to pass, but because his longing never ceased to matter. His dream was never just about economics or class. It was about belonging, about restoring the thread between who we are and what we create. He believed that labor could be more than survival, it could be expression, art, communion. He saw in humanity not a machine, but a symphony waiting to be heard. That symphony plays in unexpected places. In cooperatives where workers share both burden and reward. In movements that prize sustainability over speed. In voices that ask not only how to grow, but how to care. His revolution, once imagined as fire, has become a slow, steady light, one that asks us to see the world not through ideology, but through tenderness. For the truth is this: every age has its empire, its system, its illusion of permanence. And every age, too, must face its reflection, the moment when it asks whether progress has outpaced purpose. Marx's voice returns in those moments, not as judgment, but as memory. A quiet reminder that civilization is not a race to build higher, but a promise to build better. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is still and the hum of life softens into silence, you can almost feel that promise breathing. In the rustle of trees outside a worker's window, in the soft light of a phone screen where someone writes a poem they will never sell, in the shared laughter of strangers who have nothing and yet everything in common. In those fleeting moments, the dream he began flickers, not as a blueprint, but as a feeling. Because in the end, Marx's greatest gift was not a system to follow, but a way to see, to notice the unseen, to care for the forgotten, to remember that behind every price is a person, behind every number a name. He believed that history moves not in circles, but in spirals, that every return is a little wiser than the last. Perhaps that is the eternal return, not the repetition of struggle, but the evolution of understanding. We fall, we rise, we learn, we soften. And through it all, his whisper lingers, patient, steady, almost kind. The world you live in was made by human hands. And it can be made again. The fire of the 19th century has dimmed into embers, but those embers glow still, in every act of fairness, in every question asked in kindness, in every dream that dares to imagine a gentler world. And as this long story nears its quiet end, one truth shines softly above all others, that ideas, like stars, do not die when they fade from sight. They remain, glowing in the vastness of time, guiding those who still seek meaning in the dark. It deepens, and history exhales. The noise of centuries fades until only the quiet remains, the soft hum of thought, the steady rhythm of time moving forward. In that stillness, Karl Marx feels less like a figure from the past and more like a presence, distant, but listening. The man who once challenged kings and Kapital now lingers like a faint echo, not commanding, but reminding. His life was filled with struggle, poverty, exile, misunderstanding, yet he never stopped believing that human beings could create a world worthy of their own hearts. To many, he was a revolutionary. To some, a prophet. But to those who look closer, he was simply a man who refused to accept despair. He saw the suffering of others and could not look away. He turned it into words, not to incite hatred, but to awaken empathy. His revolution began, and perhaps ended, in that tenderness. Time, of course, has changed the shape of his dream. Nations rose in his name, some noble, some cruel, each distorting the melody he once played. Yet even through the noise of politics, the essence remains untouched, the belief that no life should be wasted, no voice unheard. That humanity's highest calling is not conquest, but connection. When you walk through the ruins of the industrial world he once condemned, the abandoned mills, the silent railways, the soot-faded walls, you can still feel his presence, not as judgment, but as memory. The workers who sang beneath those smokestacks carried his hope, even if they never knew his name. Their calloused hands shaped the modern world. And in their endurance, in their quiet dignity, his ideas found their truest home. Now, in the hum of digital life, his questions return. They hide in the algorithms and the screens, in the invisible labor that powers our days. Who benefits? Who is left unseen? What does it mean to create, and to belong, in a world that moves faster than its own heart? These are not relics of the past. They are the questions of every age. And perhaps that is the gentlest truth of all, Marx was never about answers. He was about awakening. About the courage to look at the world, and at ourselves, and to begin again. As the world turns, his words no longer burn with revolution. They glow instead with reflection, a steady flame guiding those who seek meaning amid motion. In the stillness between days, his dream hums softly, that one day, work will no longer divide us from ourselves, that every human life will be lived in fullness, in freedom, in quiet joy. If you listen closely, beyond the hum of cities and machines, beyond the noise of debate and division, you can hear it, a faint rhythm beneath everything. It's the sound of labor and laughter, of footsteps in every corner of the earth, all moving towards something unseen but deeply felt. It is the heartbeat of humanity, persistent, patient, and eternal. And so, as this story closes, the circle gently completes itself. The man who sought to change the world ends not in triumph or tragedy, but in continuity, a life that became a question that became a movement that became memory. The fire he lit still flickers, not in revolutions, but in conversations, not in manifestos, but in the quiet choices people make every day to be fairer, kinder, more awake. Because history, for all its noise and ruin, is also a lullaby, a song about who we've been, and who we might yet become. Rest now, in the calm of understanding. The story of Karl Marx is not one of endings, but of return, the endless turning of ideas into dreams, and dreams into tomorrow. And as sleep begins to draw close, imagine the faint sound of a river flowing, not the Thames, nor the Rhine, but the slow, patient current of time itself, carrying his voice forward, softer now, almost a whisper, workers of all lands, be kind to one another. The world is still yours to make. And with that whisper, the night grows still again. The story rests. The dream continues. If these words carried you gently toward thought or toward sleep, let this channel stay beside you, to remind you that every history, no matter how vast, is also a bedtime story about being human.